Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, as we celebrate the International Day of the Girl Child today, I am particularly delighted that we have an opportunity to focus attention on financing education for girls, as well as how to ensure that all girls start and finish school. In my travels throughout the region, I consistently hear from refugee girls and their families about their aspirations for higher education. The aspirations and the reality are, however, not always aligned.
Just to show you the brief and the struggle that girls go through in terms of education in the family, being a patriarchal family. The story for me, I think it has just, it's closer to home. It has hit exactly the kind of life that I have struggled to get here in school, and it has really resonated with. And there are many girls out there crying for change and to be able to make it up to the highest level of education.
The first and foremost way of financing girls' education is through our budgets, whether at the federal or national level or at subnational level. And this is already happening in many countries. But the issue is the size and quality of the spending. Within those budgets, it's important for governments to ensure there are girls-specific budget lines. And there's a very interesting example of a budget line for girls' hostels in Malawi, which is very good. In Kenya, for instance, we have seen some counties introduce budget lines for scholarships and bursaries for girls. We have also seen some governments introducing social assistance programs to help the poorest and most vulnerable children access the much needed education. And this can be done through modalities such as cash transfers. And within that, we can embed school bonuses. We have seen programs such as the Basic Education Assistance Module in Zimbabwe and many other examples in our region. But besides specific allocations, there are also policy measures that have been introduced by some governments, and we encourage many to do so. For example, waiver of school fees. Many countries in this region have introduced a free primary education, but more needs to be done to address challenges at the secondary and tertiary level.
Our intention as a government is to increase domestic financing to all activities promoting girls' education by increasing budgetary allocation to the education sector in line with Continental Education Strategy for Africa and the Dakar Framework on the rights to education. For the very first time, sometime last year, we had a budget line for provision of free sanitary wear to our girl child in our schools. We also have school feeding programs that help us to keep our kids in school.
In many countries, education spending is allocated on a per pupil basis. So if you look at an education budget, it will say something like spend per pupil. This seems fair on the face of it. However, what if there are more girls out of school than boys? This is the case in 62% of low-income countries. What it does mean is to recognize and understand the different impacts of education spending on girls and boys, and then work to redress that balance. Gender-responsive public expenditure management. I know that's a mouthful, but this is a key tool in financing for girls' education. So what all of this does is to say, we need to understand who are the children farthest behind, and often those are girls. And today on International Day of the Girls, we're focusing on those children. And how do we save space in our budget? But this is a key tool in financing for girls' education. So what all of this does is to say, we need to understand who are the children farthest behind, and often those are girls. And today on International Day of the Girls, we're focusing on those children. And how do we save space in our budget? How do we elevate these children? How do we elevate these girls who are out of school and provide funding from education ministries for them to come back to school, for them to have alternative learning pathways, including especially in humanitarian and protracted crisis situations.
To sustain funding for education, governments must meet the international regional benchmark of 20% of the national budget allocated for education. And that again is in the Education Framework for Action 2030. So governments have made the commitment, and we must all help them to meet those commitments. Only 3% of global humanitarian funding is spent on education. So we need to make sure that when there is a crisis, that education is not lost.
We also have a very strong gender strategy and the gender policy that we are rolling out. So that's part of our commitment to ensure that refugee girls, above all, are given top priority.
Of African private sector organizations that are taking on and exercising a leadership role, using their voice and convening power to influence others to find solutions for the refugee challenge in Africa. Some of the things that I think private sector can do, as we heard, there's always financing gaps for scholarships. And so setting up a scholarship fund like Equity Bank did through its foundation for the Wings to Fly program, and I heard Dr. Bob mention that earlier, an amazing program with a national reach that's really having a transformative impact on the lives of young people across the country. Or private sector can channel funds to amazing organizations like FAWE, and I know that we'll hear from Martha later on. But this is a relatively easy way for private sector to contribute. But private sector also has a role to play in creating internships and work opportunities for young people, particularly young women, refugees and displaced youth, and young people with disabilities. We know that young people need to practice their skills, they need to apply the knowledge that they're getting through education so that they are prepared to be successful in the workforce. So that's a really practical thing that private sector can do. Likewise, starting a mentorship program, pairing up members of your workforce with young people who are in school, in university, or just starting their careers.
The GP will support countries to systematically identify and address barriers to education that affect boys and girls differently. So that could be gender-based violence, teen pregnancy, early marriage, or limited access to remote learning. So we know that identifying the correct barriers is a critical first step to being able to address them. We will also work with partners to identify how different stakeholders in GP mechanism can strengthen gender equality. In the 30 countries where girls are most lagging behind, GP will provide additional resources and targeted funding through the new Girls Education Accelerator to address these challenges. So many countries, which is very exciting to me, many countries in this region are eligible for this additional financing. So that includes Comoros, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Malawi, Mozambique, Somalia, South Sudan, and Zimbabwe.
Is using our development diplomacy, so bringing together the foreign, the FCO and DFID together, we now have much bigger development muscles than we ever had before. So it's how we use our development diplomacy to bring partners together to catalyze change and mobilize greater investment. And importantly, through that program, we've learned a lot about cost effectiveness. And I think in girls, in financing girls' education, that focus on cost effectiveness needs to really be stepped up. Again, this idea of bang for our buck. We've just done some recent financial work in Uganda with the government of Uganda, looking at where is the fiscal space to spend more on girls and on education in general? And if we can generate additional resources, what are the policy options to get, again, those best results? So evidence, I think, is absolutely critical.
It is our hope that after today's engagement, ministries of education and finance will continue to work together with their development partners and the private sector to innovate and improve financing of girls' education. Most notably, policymakers should consider the vulnerabilities and unique situation of girls when making spending decisions.
It's not more about the size, but it's more about the quality of investment. Because in many cases, we may say we are supporting 1,000 girls, but what are we giving the 1,000 girls? I think it's about the quality that is very, very critical. And one of the speakers went ahead to say, it's not about the publications that we make, it's not about the documentaries that we come about, but it's more about the quality of investment that we make.